"You're just not good enough for me anymore," she said during dinner with my family. I stayed silent, finished my meal, and paid the bill. The next morning, I canceled the wedding venue, refunded everything, and sent her one message: "Now you don't have to settle." Her parents called me first. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Thanks. "You're just not good enough for me anymore." That's what she said. Not in a quiet corner of our apartment. Not during a private argument behind closed doors. Not even in the car on the way home from somewhere. She said it at a dinner table. A dinner table surrounded by my mother, my brother Cole, his wife, and my two aunts who had flown in specifically to celebrate our upcoming wedding. She said it like she was commenting on the weather. Calm, almost rehearsed. And then she picked up her fork and took another bite of her salmon. The table went completely silent. My mother stopped mid-sentence. Cole put down his glass. His wife looked at the tablecloth like it suddenly became the most interesting thing in the room. My aunts exchanged a glance so sharp it could have cut through the tension that had just swallowed the entire restaurant. And me? I just sat there. I looked at her. I looked at the candlelight flickering between us. I looked at the half-eaten plate in front of me. And I picked up my fork and kept eating. I need you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a man who reacts impulsively. I was raised by a woman who taught me that dignity is something you maintain, not something you perform. My mother always said that how a person behaves when they're hurt tells you everything about who they really are. So I sat at that table. I finished every bite on my plate. I ordered dessert. I laughed at something my Aunt Patricia said. Wait, no, her name was Renee. I laughed at something my Aunt Renee said. I made eye contact with Cole across the table and gave him a single, slow nod that said, "I'm fine. Don't make this worse." And when the bill came, I paid it. The entire thing. For 7 people. Without blinking. We had been together for 4 years. Engaged for 8 months. The wedding was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. The venue was booked. The flowers were ordered. The photographer had already been paid in full. My mother had spent 2 weeks finding the perfect dress. My aunts had flown from 3 different states just to be at that dinner. And the woman sitting across from me, the one I had proposed to on a rooftop at sunset with a ring that had taken me 6 months to save for, had just decided that a family dinner at a mid-range Italian restaurant was the appropriate setting to inform me that I was no longer sufficient. That's what it felt like. Like she was filing a complaint. Like I was a product that had failed to meet her updated expectations. The drive home was quiet. She sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. Not crying. Not apologetic. Not even tense. Just scrolling. Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of the most important pre-wedding dinner of my life. I drove with both hands on the wheel. I didn't say a word. Not because I didn't have things to say. I had 1,000 things to say. I had things to say that would have stripped the paint off the walls. But something had shifted inside me the moment those words left her mouth at that table. Something that I didn't fully understand yet. Something quiet and cold and impossibly certain. When we got home, she went straight to the bathroom. I heard the shower turn on. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and I just breathed. In, out, in, out. I didn't cry. I didn't punch anything. I didn't even feel angry, really. Not in the way I expected. I felt something else entirely. Something that took me a few hours to name. I felt clear. I want to tell you who Claire was before she became the person sitting at that dinner table. Because she wasn't always like this. For years ago, she was the woman who brought me soup when I had a cold and stayed on the phone with me until 2 in the morning just because I'd had a rough week at work. She was sharp. Funny in a way that surprised you every time. She remembered small things. The name of my 3rd grade teacher, the song that was playing when I first told her I loved her, the fact that I hated cilantro but always forgot to ask them to leave it out. She was the kind of person who made a room warmer just by walking into it. That was the woman I fell in love with. That was the woman I proposed to. But something started changing about 18 months ago, and I noticed it. I just kept telling myself it wasn't what I thought it was. It started with her new job. She got a promotion at her firm, a significant one, and with that promotion came a new crowd. Colleagues who drove cars I'd only seen in magazines. Friends who talked about their vacations in the same casual tone that most people talk about grocery runs. She started going to dinners I wasn't invited to. Events where, apparently, the +1 situation was complicated. She started coming home later. Not in a suspicious way. In a way that felt more like she was living a life that was slowly outgrowing the one we shared. The first real sign was when she started making comments about my job. I'm an electrician. A licensed, unionized, very well-compensated electrician who owns his own van, has a list of regular clients, and clears more in a year than most people assume. But it's not a job that comes with a corner office or a title that impresses people at cocktail parties. And I started noticing that she'd stopped mentioning what I did for a living when we were around her new friends. Not in a dramatic way, just a quiet erasure. He works in the trades, she'd say, if anyone asked. Like she was trying to make it sound like less. The second sign was the apartment. She started making comments about where we lived. It was a 2-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood. We'd picked it together. We'd painted the walls together. We'd argued for 45 minutes about whether to get the sectional or the L-shaped sofa and then laughed about it for weeks. But suddenly, it was too small. Suddenly, the neighborhood was fine. But suddenly, our life together had a series of silent asterisks attached to it. And I noticed all of it. I just kept thinking she was going through an adjustment period. I kept thinking that once the new job excitement faded, she'd come back to herself. I kept choosing to believe the version of her that I'd loved for 3 years instead of paying attention to the one standing right in front of me. That's on me. I know that. About 3 months before the dinner, we had an argument. A real one. She'd come home from a work event and mentioned, almost casually, that her colleague Danielle had just gotten engaged to a hedge fund manager. And the ring, apparently, was extraordinary. I asked her if she was happy for them. She said yes. And then she paused. And then she said, "It just makes you think about things, you know?" I asked her what things. She said, "Just what your life could look like." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I asked her directly, "Are you unhappy with our life?" She said no. She said she was just tired. She said I was overthinking it. And I let her tell me that. Because it was easier than the alternative. 2 weeks after that, she started suggesting we postpone the wedding. Not cancel. Postpone. She said she wanted more time to think. I asked her what she needed to think about. She said the timing. She said the venue felt rushed. She said maybe we jumped into the engagement a little fast. I reminded her that she had cried when I proposed. Happy tears, she'd said. The happiest she'd ever been, she'd said. She told me not to bring that up. She told me that people grow and change and that I needed to understand that. I told her that I did understand that. I told her that what I didn't understand was why growth apparently required her to become someone who was ashamed of our life. She didn't respond to that. She went to bed. And the next morning, she acted like the conversation hadn't happened. We never postponed the wedding. We never addressed what she'd said. We just kept going. Like two people on a train that neither of them wanted to stop. Now I want to go back to the dinner. Because I need you to understand that it wasn't the first comment she'd made. It was just the first one she'd made in public. In front of my family. The dinner had started normally enough. My mom was happy. She'd been talking about the wedding for weeks, making lists, sending me pictures of centerpieces at 11 o'clock at night. Cole and his wife were in a good mood. My aunts were loud and warm and kept refilling their wine glasses and telling stories I'd heard 100 times. Claire had been quiet since we arrived. Not visibly cold, just dimmed, like someone had turned her brightness down 3 notches. I'd noticed it in the car on the way there. I'd squeezed her hand. She'd squeezed back. That was the last warm thing that happened that evening. About 40 minutes into dinner, my mom was talking about the rehearsal dinner plans. She was describing a venue she'd found near the waterfront. She was excited. Her hands were moving. Her eyes were bright. And then Claire, without looking up from her plate, said it. "You're just not good enough for me anymore." She said it quietly, but not quietly enough. The words hit the table like a dropped glass. My mom stopped talking mid-word. And Claire finally looked up. Not at me. Around the table. Like she wanted to see the reaction. Like she'd been holding on to that sentence for a long time and had finally found a place to put it down. My Aunt Renee said, very carefully, "I'm sorry." And Claire looked at me then and said, "I'm just being honest," and went back to her salmon. I think about what I should have said in that moment. I've run through it 100 times since then. I could have called her out. I could have asked her to explain herself. I could have stood up and walked out. I could have cried. I could have gotten angry. But none of that felt like the right response to what she'd done. Because here's what I understood, sitting at that table in the silence she had created. She had chosen this moment deliberately. She had not slipped. She had not lost control of her emotions. She had made a calculated decision to say something devastating in front of the people I loved most. And she had done it calmly, and she had done it without remorse. And the only response to that kind of deliberate cruelty is not an outburst. The only response to that is stillness. So I picked up my fork, and I kept eating. My mom tried to restart conversation. She tried to smooth it over with something about the rehearsal venue. Cole's wife asked a question about the flower arrangements. Cole caught my eye and I shook my head barely, and the dinner limped forward like a wounded thing. Claire ate. She answered questions when spoken to. She smiled twice, and not once did she apologize. Not once did she look at me with anything that resembled regret. When the check came, I took it. My aunt tried to argue. I told her I had it. I paid it. I left a tip that was probably too generous given the state I was in. And I walked out of that restaurant with my mother's hand briefly on my arm and Cole's eyes following me and my fiancée walking 3 steps behind me like nothing had happened. She fell asleep quickly that night. I don't know how. I lay there for hours. Not crying. Not spiraling. Just thinking. Thinking about the last 18 months. Thinking about every comment she'd made. Every dinner she'd come home from with that slightly distant look. Every time I'd caught her scrolling through Instagram at 2 in the morning looking at someone else's life. Thinking about the word settle. That's what it came down to, really. She thought she was settling. She thought I was the consolation prize she'd accepted before she understood what the top shelf looked like. And the longer I lay there in the dark, the clearer one thing became. I couldn't marry someone who felt that way about me. Not because my ego was bruised. Not because I was furious. But because no person, no matter how much they love someone, can build a life with someone who sees them as less than. It doesn't work that way. It corrodes. Slowly, quietly, until nothing is left but resentment and performance. And I had spent 4 years loving this woman with everything I had. I was not going to spend the next 40 doing the same thing while she privately wished I were someone else. At around 3 in the morning, I made a decision. And once I made it, I felt the most peaceful I had felt in months. My alarm went off at 6. I got up. I showered. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and I opened my contacts. And I started making calls. The wedding venue was first. I told them there had been a change in plans. I told them the wedding was not happening. The woman on the phone was professional and kind. She walked me through the cancellation policy. I had booked within the refundable window by 3 days. I got most of it back. Then I called the photographer. Then the florist. Then the catering coordinator. Then the band. Then the hotel block I'd reserved for out-of-town guests. One by one. Methodical. Calm. Claire was still asleep when I made the last call. I could hear her through the bedroom wall, breathing steadily, completely unaware that 3 weeks of planning had just been quietly undone while she slept. I refunded what I could. I released what I couldn't. I sent emails to the guests we'd already sent save the dates to, keeping it brief, keeping it dignified. The wedding will not be taking place as planned. We appreciate your understanding and apologize for any inconvenience. And then I picked up my phone, and I opened my messages. And I typed her one sentence. Now you don't have to settle. I sent it. I put the phone face down on the table. I poured myself another cup of coffee. And I waited. She came out of the bedroom 40 minutes later. Hair still messy. Wearing my hoodie, which she'd stolen years ago and which I'd stopped asking for back. She was looking at her phone. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and stared at the screen. She read the message. She looked up at me. Her face was doing something complicated. What does this mean? She said. I told her it meant exactly what it said. She asked me to explain. I told her I didn't think there was much to explain. She looked back at her phone. She scrolled through it, maybe checking her email, maybe seeing the venue cancellation, maybe connecting dots. And then something shifted in her expression. You canceled everything? She said. I told her I had. She stared at me. Because of one thing I said at dinner? And there it was. One thing. I looked at her standing in that doorway, wearing my hoodie, holding her phone, and I felt something quiet and final settle over me like a blanket. I told her it wasn't one thing. I told her it was the thing that made it impossible to pretend anymore. She asked what I was pretending about. And I told her. I told her about every comment she'd made over the last 18 months that she'd probably forgotten the moment she said it, but that I had cataloged and stored and carried around like stones in my pockets. I told her about the way she'd stopped mentioning my job to her friends. I told her about the dinner parties she'd gone to alone because my presence was apparently complicated. I told her about the apartment suddenly being too small, the neighborhood suddenly being just fine, the life we'd built together suddenly carrying all those quiet asterisks. I told her about the conversation after Danielle got engaged. I told her about the proposal to postpone. I told her about all the mornings she'd woken up next to me with that distant look that said she was already somewhere else in her head. And then I told her that last night, in front of my mother, my brother, and my aunts who had flown in to celebrate us, she had finally said out loud what I had been watching her think for a very long time. I didn't yell any of it. I said it the way you read a list. Steady, clear, without drama. She stood in the doorway the entire time. She didn't interrupt me. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, I didn't mean it like that. I asked her how she meant it. She said she'd been stressed. She said the wedding pressure was getting to her. She said she hadn't been sleeping well. I told her I understood all of that. And I told her that none of it explained why her chosen outlet for stress was to announce my inadequacy to my family at the dinner table. She pressed her lips together. She looked down at her phone again. I don't know why she kept looking at her phone. Maybe she was hoping something on it would help her. Maybe she was just not ready to look at me. She said, so that's it? You're just done? And I told her yes. I told her that I was done. Not because I didn't love her. Not because I hadn't tried. But because I refused to marry someone into a relationship they'd already decided was beneath them. And I told her she should probably start making arrangements to get her things. She left. Not immediately. She stood in that doorway for another few minutes. Then she went to the bedroom. I heard her moving around. I heard a drawer open. I heard her on the phone, voice low. An hour later, she came out with a bag and her keys. She stood at the door for a moment. She looked like she wanted to say something. I waited. She didn't say anything. She left. I sat in the quiet of the apartment for a long time after the door closed. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like the very specific kind of grief you feel when something ends not with a fight, but with a slow, irreversible understanding. My phone buzzed. Cole, you okay? I told him I would be. He called anyway. He didn't ask me a lot of questions. He just stayed on the line with me for 20 minutes while I sat on the couch and looked at the wall. That's what brothers are for. The first call from her side came about 4 hours later. I expected it to be Claire. It wasn't. It was her father, a man named Walter who I had met dozens of times over the years. A man who had shaken my hand firmly at Thanksgiving and asked me about my business and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. A man who had given a small toast at our engagement dinner that made my mother tear up. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. I owe you an apology, he said. Not hello. Now we need to talk. I owe you an apology. I told him he didn't have to call. He said he did. He said he'd heard what happened from Claire's mother, who had apparently heard it from Claire this morning, and that the moment he heard, he needed to pick up the phone. He said what she did was wrong. He said it plainly, without qualification, without the softening that parents usually apply to their children's behavior. He said, she embarrassed you in front of your family, and that is not something I will excuse regardless of whatever she was going through. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just listened. He asked me if my decision was final. I told him it was. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, good. He said, you deserve better than that, son. And I mean that. And then he apologized again. And he hung up. I sat there holding my phone and staring at nothing for a while after that call. Her mother called 20 minutes later. That conversation was different. Her mother, a woman named Beverly who had always been perfectly warm to me in the specific way that some mothers are warm to men their daughters date, while secretly keeping a running evaluation, was crying before she finished her first sentence. She told me she was horrified. She told me she hadn't raised Claire to behave that way. She told me she was so sorry. And then, somewhere in the middle of the apology, she shifted. She started asking me if I'd thought this through. She started saying that Claire was under a lot of pressure with the promotion. She started saying that maybe the wedding had come too fast, and everyone was feeling the strain of it. She started saying that surely, after 4 years, we owed it to each other to at least talk before making any permanent decisions. I told her, respectfully, that we had talked. I told her that I had already made my decision. She cried harder. She said, she loves you. I know she does. And I told her I believed that, in some version of things, that was probably true. But I also told her that love is not the same thing as respect, and that you can love someone and still look at them as a step down from what you think you deserve, and that I would not spend my life being someone's compromise. Beverly went quiet after that. She sniffled. She said she understood. I don't know if she actually did, but she stopped arguing, and we said goodbye. Claire called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. She called again an hour later. Voicemail. The third time, I answered. She sounded different from the morning. The composure she'd maintained in the kitchen was gone. She sounded like she'd been crying for hours. She said she needed to see me. She said we needed to talk properly. She said she was so sorry. She said it multiple times. I told her I'd heard her. She asked if I would meet her. I told her I didn't think that was a good idea right now. She asked why not. I told her because I'd already said everything I needed to say. She said I hadn't given her a chance to explain herself properly. I told her I'd given her 8 months of engagement, 18 months of noticing her pull away, and the entire previous night to say something. Anything. And she had chosen to go to sleep instead. She went quiet. Then she said, I panicked. I asked her what she panicked about. She said, about the wedding. About the future. About whether I was making the right choice. I told her I understood that people had doubts. I told her that doubts were human and normal and something a couple could work through together. But I told her that broadcasting those doubts publicly, in the way she had, to the people who loved me most, was not a panic response. That was something she'd been thinking for a while. And last night, it had just found its way out. She didn't deny it. That told me everything. I want to be honest about something here. Because I know how this kind of story can go, and I don't want to present myself as someone without flaws in this situation. There were things I could have done differently. When she first started pulling away, I could have pressed harder. I could have demanded a real conversation instead of accepting the surface-level reassurances she gave me. When she suggested postponing the wedding, I could have treated that as the serious flag it was instead of hoping we'd just naturally move past it. When I noticed her stop mentioning my job to her friends, I could have named it directly instead of filing it away and quietly accumulating resentment. I am not a perfect person. I made the mistakes that people make when they love someone and don't want to see what they're looking at. But here's what I know. None of those mistakes made what she did acceptable. None of them explained the dinner table. None of them justified choosing a family gathering, a celebration, as the venue for whatever that was. Because I have sat with that moment, turned it over, examined it from every angle. And I cannot find a version of it that isn't, at its core, a moment of contempt. She looked at me across that table, surrounded by the people who love me, and she said something designed to diminish me. Not in anger, in calm. That's the part one keep coming back to. The calm. Over the next 2 days, things got complicated in the way that endings always do. There were logistics. Her things were still at the apartment. The engagement ring was still on her finger, apparently. There were mutual friends who didn't know what to do with themselves. There were 2 group chats that suddenly went very quiet. My mother called every morning. She didn't push. She didn't offer opinions I hadn't asked for. She just called and asked how I was sleeping and whether I'd eaten. My mother is the kind of person who shows love through very practical questions. Cole came over on the second night with food and beer, and we watched something neither of us actually paid attention to, and it was exactly what I needed. Claire texted more than she called now. Long texts. Paragraphs. The kind of messages that must have taken her an hour to write. She explained herself. She contextualized herself. She apologized in elaborate, detailed ways that made clear she'd been thinking about this very seriously. I read them all. I responded to very few. Because what she was asking for, what all those carefully constructed words were ultimately asking for, was a chance to rewind. And I didn't have a rewind to offer her. On the 3rd day, something happened that I hadn't expected. Danielle, the colleague whose engagement had sparked that conversation 3 months ago, reached out to me. I barely knew her. We'd met a handful of times at work events of Claire's that I'd attended. She'd always seemed pleasant but distant. She messaged me on Instagram of all places. She said she'd heard what happened. She said she wanted me to know something. She said she'd been in one of those work dinners several months ago, the kind Claire had attended alone. She said that at that dinner, Claire had talked about me, at length, and not in the way a person talks about someone they love. She said Claire had spent the better part of an evening comparing our life to those of the couples around her and had, Danielle's words, seemed embarrassed to be where she was. She said she'd almost messaged me then. She said she hadn't because it wasn't her place. But now, she said, it felt like she needed to tell me. Because apparently I was blaming myself. Apparently word had gotten around that I was walking around wondering what I could have done differently. And Danielle wanted me to stop. She said, this wasn't about you not being enough. This was about her convincing herself she needed something different. That's her issue, not yours. I thanked her. I sat with that message for a long time. It didn't change anything, but it confirmed something. The ring arrived in the mail on day 4. She'd shipped it. I didn't know she'd done that until I found the small padded envelope in the mailbox with no return address. I sat with it in my hand for a while. It was a good ring. I'd picked it myself. 3 months of research, 2 months of saving extra, and then one afternoon in a small jewelry shop downtown, where a quiet man with glasses had walked me through 6 different options and somehow understood exactly what I was looking for. I put it back in the box. I put the box in the drawer of my nightstand. I didn't know what I'd do with it eventually. That felt like a decision for a future version of me who had more distance from all of this. The part that stayed with me longest wasn't the dinner. It wasn't the cancellations. It wasn't even the calls from her parents. It was something Cole said to me on the night he came over with food and beer. We were sitting there watching something neither of us was watching, and he turned to me at some point and said, very quietly, "You know what I kept thinking about, sitting at that table?" I told him what. He said, "I kept thinking about the night you called me after you proposed to her. You were so, I don't even know the word. You were sure. Like I'd never heard you sound that sure about anything." I remembered that call. It was late. I'd been shaking a little from adrenaline. She'd said yes, and I'd walked back to the car and called Cole immediately because I needed to tell someone. He said, "That's the version of you I want back. The one who was just completely sure." I told him I didn't know where that version had gone. He said, "He's still there. He's just been spending a year trying to convince himself that someone else's doubts were actually his problem to solve." I didn't respond to that right away, but I've thought about it every day since. About a week after the dinner, I had one final conversation with Claire. She'd asked if we could meet in person. I agreed, because I thought it was the right thing to do. We met at a coffee shop on neutral ground. She looked tired. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. She looked, honestly, like someone who had made a significant mistake and had been sitting alone with it for a week. And part of me, the part that had loved her for 4 years, ached a little at that. But aching isn't the same as changing your mind. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said she'd been talking to a therapist. She said she understood now that she had let the environment she was in at work warp her perspective in ways she hadn't even fully recognized while it was happening. She said the new crowd, the money, the status, the comparison, all of it had gotten into her head and made her measure things differently than she used to. She said she knew that. She said she wanted to work on it. She looked at me across the table and she said, "I want to work on us." And I looked at her, and I believed her. I believed that she meant every word of it. I believed that she had genuinely been doing some version of the reflection she described. I believed that somewhere underneath all of it, she loved me in whatever complicated way she was capable of. And I told her all of that. And then I told her it wasn't enough. Not because I was punishing her. Not because I couldn't forgive. But because some things, once said, cannot be unsaid. Because the image of her sitting across from me at that table, surrounded by my family, saying those words with that particular calm, that image was not going to go away. And I was not going to spend the rest of my life married to someone while secretly wondering when the next version of that moment would arrive. She nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She just nodded and looked down at her coffee cup and said, "I know." That I know broke something in me a little, because it meant she understood. It meant she wasn't fighting it. It meant that somewhere underneath the apologies and the therapy and the "I want to work on us," she knew. She knew this was real. She knew it was done. We sat there for a few more minutes without saying much. And then we said goodbye, and I walked out. I'm not going to tell you that everything that came after was simple or clean. It wasn't. It was messy in the way that endings always are when 4 years of a life are involved. There were belongings to sort through. There were accounts to untangle. There were people in our shared social circle who had to decide which side of the line they were standing on. There were nights where the apartment felt impossibly quiet. There were moments in the first few weeks where I'd reach for my phone out of habit and start typing a message to her before remembering. Grief doesn't care how justified your decision was. Grief just shows up and sits in the corner and stares at you regardless of who was wrong. But here's what I can tell you. Not once did I doubt the decision. Not in those quiet nights. Not in those phantom message moments. Not even in the coffee shop when she said "I know" and something in me broke a little. Because the clarity I felt sitting at that dinner table, the clarity I felt lying awake in the dark that night, the clarity I felt pouring my second cup of coffee while the sun came up and I made those phone calls, that clarity never left. It was still there. It was still saying the same thing. You do not marry someone who considers you a compromise. You do not build a life with someone who needs to settle in order to choose you. You do not say vows across from someone who looks at you and sees a lesser version of what they wish they had. About a month later, my Aunt Renee called me. She's the older of the 2 aunts who had been at the dinner. She's the kind of woman who says exactly what she thinks, always has, and makes no apologies for it. She told me she was proud of me. She said she'd been watching me that night at the restaurant. She said she'd watched me stay perfectly still while the world cracked around me. She said she'd watched me pay that check and tip the server well and walk out with my head up. And she said, "Your grandfather would have called that class." That hit me somewhere I didn't expect. My grandfather had been gone for 11 years, but I knew exactly what she meant. She said, "Some people confuse quiet strength for weakness. Don't ever let anyone convince you that the stillness you have is a limitation." I told her I'd try. She said, "You already did, that night." I held on to that. The last thing I want to tell you is about something small. About 3 weeks after everything, I was at a job site. New client. A house that needed a full rewire. Big project. The kind I like. I was in the middle of it, hands full, mind occupied, when I realized something. I was humming, not thinking about it, just humming. Some song that had been on the radio that morning. I stopped and noticed it. And I thought, when did I last hum something without thinking about it? I tried to remember. I couldn't. It had been a while. A long while. People ask me sometimes what the one message was really about. The "now you don't have to settle" message. They assume it was anger. They assume it was a parting shot. A way of getting the last word. And I understand why it reads that way from the outside. But it wasn't. It was the most literal thing I could have said. She had decided, quietly, and then eventually out loud, that choosing me meant settling for something less than she deserved. And by canceling everything, by stepping back, by removing myself from the equation entirely, I was doing exactly what the message said. I was freeing her from that. I was not going to be something she settled for. I was not going to let her wake up 5 years into a marriage, standing in a kitchen of a life she decided was beneath her, resenting the person next to her for not being more. I cared about her too much for that. Strange as that sounds, the message wasn't anger. It was the most loving thing I had left to give her. Her father texts me sometimes. Not often. Maybe once every few weeks. Sometimes it's a question about something practical. Once it was just to say he hoped I was doing well. I always respond. Because Walter, whatever else, was honest with me in a moment when honesty cost him something. That matters. Beverly stopped reaching out after the coffee shop meeting. I think she understood by then that the door was genuinely closed. I don't hold anything against her. She was a mother trying to protect her daughter the best way she knew how. Claire and I don't speak. It's not angry. It's just finished. There's a difference. I'm doing okay. I want to say that clearly for anyone who needs to hear the ending. I'm doing okay. I still go to work. I still have my brother. I still have my mother who calls every morning and asks if I've eaten. I still have my Aunt Renee and whatever is left of my grandfather's version of quiet class. I still have the ring in the drawer, which I'll figure out eventually. I still have the apartment with the walls we painted and the sofa we argued about for 45 minutes. I still have the version of me that called Cole after the proposal, shaking with adrenaline, completely sure. He's still here. He's coming back more every day. That's the whole story. No villain. No hero. Just two people who loved each other until one of them decided the love wasn't enough to make up for the life she wished she had instead. And one man who sat at a dinner table, stayed quiet, finished his meal, paid the check, and walked out with the only thing he had left, his dignity.